Thank you for these announcements. Today it's my real pleasure to introduce my colleague, Jim Lennox, who is Professor of History and Philosophy of Science here at Pitt. Jim has been with us for quite some time, and he's been the director of the center for nearly 10 years, as well as the director of the Classic Philosophy and Ancient Science program for nearly 7 years, I believe. And he's extremely well known for his work on Aristotle's philosophy, particularly his philosophy of science, philosophy of biology, or his work on William Harvey, his work on Darwin, and more broadly, his work in the philosophy and history and philosophy of biology. I think it's worth noting that he has a book which is nearly hitting the press, called Sensing and Knowing, Aristotle on Norms of Inquiry, which we are actually all hoping to read next year, hopefully, if everything goes well. The book is going to be published with Cambridge University Press. I'm very happy also to be able to announce that there will be a workshop on Jim's work in April. The workshop will start on the 20th. And will extend up to the April 21st. And you're all invited to come to the workshop. It's really an excellent program in the history and philosophy of biology with work on Aristotle, Darwin, and so on and so forth. So again, if you're interested, please let us know and send an email to Joyce. You can find the program of the workshop on our website as usual. So without further ado, let me introduce Jim. And the talk is going to be called Eroteticism. I was very afraid of making a mistake on this one. I've been practicing for the last 2 hours. Aristotle on the epistemic centrality of curiosity. Jim.
Thanks very much, Edward. Yes, this is, I've been here for almost, actually 4 years. This is my last term as a professor. I'll be professor emeritus, apparently, after this. Yes, I did, it was a little cheeky of me to use that word, eroteticism. That's how I'm going to pronounce it. I expected people would have to pause once or twice before they realized that it wasn't eroticism. Samuel Johnson always has interesting things to say about almost everything. I, however, prefer what Nabokov said about curiosity, insubordination in its purest form. And that's my grandson over there on your right, being insubordinate with one of my cats when he was about 2 years old. My grandson's going to be somewhat prominent in this lecture, as it turns out, because he's curious. All right, so what is eroticism or eroteticism? There's a paper in Phil Review in 1955 by Arthur and Mary Pryor called Erotetic Logic. This was sort of during a period when relevance logics were very, very popular and getting a lot of attention. And most people that write on erotetic logic or the logic of question and answers refer back to this paper as a kind of seminal point in the work in this area. Belknap and Anderson, in their 1976 book, Logic of Questions and Answers, for example, point back to that paper as a key instigation to their work. But they were focused primarily on questions I'm not going to be focused on today. They focused the entire book pretty much on questions that they called whether questions and which questions. There are only 2 pages in that book that are devoted to why questions, which are going to be quite prominent in this talk today. However, why questions and the relationship of why questions to scientific explanation was a major topic of interest and discussion in 20th century philosophy of science. Again, a paper that people often point to as kind of seminal on this topic is Sylvan Bromberger's Why Questions, which appeared originally in one of the Center for Philosophy of Science volumes, Mind and Cosmos, which means, I assume, it was originally given as a talk in this very lecture series, as a matter of fact. That paper was discussed and criticized by a paper in Noose in '74 by Paul Teller. Wes Salmon, of course, famously delivered a PSA or APA lecture called Why Ask Why, which was responding to this literature on the relationship between why questions and explanation. Von Frossen, of course, in The Scientific Image, had a chapter called The Pragmatics of Explanation, but there's a section of that chapter called A Theory of Why Questions. And if you are interested in sort of the history of this back and forth on the importance of why questions for understanding scientific explanation, Wes Salmon's 4 Decades of Scientific Explanation has basically a theme running through the whole book about the ups and downs of discussions of why questions in relationship to explanation. Where this paper came from, however, is not that literature. Once I got interested in this subject, I started looking at that literature, but that's not my primary interest. Primary origins of this thought was my grandson Rory. There he is when he's quite young, probably just about to start asking why, but not quite there yet. But what I noticed, he was a very prominent feature of our household for the first 4 years of his life. My wife had retired, and he stayed with us 3 days a week, all day. So we got to watch him develop and grow very, very closely. He was under a microscope. And one of the things I noticed was that almost immediately that he had learned to form concepts and relate concepts in simple sentences. He became obsessed with the question of why. That led me to wonder and think about the relationship between the human capacity for conceptual thought on the one hand and this obsession with why questions on the other hand. They seem to come on board more or less simultaneously, and my question was, is that just a coincidence, or is there some actual relationship between these two phenomena? Well, I'll conclude the talk with a Aristotelian speculation about how these two things might be related. But one thing that's really, really interesting is that some recent research on infant cognitive development has suggested that children's very first epistemic questions might actually be pre-verbal and might actually play a role in concept formation. Children's pointing and then looking at their caregivers quizzically typically is a way of getting someone to utter a word associated with the target that they're pointing at. So here's in a paper that summarizes some of that literature by Begas and Southgate, infant pointing serves interrogative functions. They say that this infant pointing is to provide labels and information about the reference that the children are pointing to. The reference towards which infants gesture, for which the caregivers provide information in response. These are most likely to enter the child's vocabulary first. So the words that children first form are more likely to be those words that they first heard by pointing and listening to what their caregivers were saying. Okay, but this is actually mostly a talk about Aristotle, not about my grandson or about the current psychological literature on curiosity. So one obvious question you might be asking is, yeah, but did Aristotle have anything interesting to say about curiosity? He does have a word in his vocabulary that is sometimes translated curiosity, philomatheia. It literally means love of learning. And in the Nicomachean Ethics, he talks about it as a pleasure of the soul and an affection of thought. More interestingly, in the last book of the Ethics, where he's talking about the relationship between pleasure and the good life, he cites it as an example of one of those living activities that we take part in because of the pleasure it brings us. He says the lover of learning, the philomathes, activates thinking regarding objects of study and so on for other living activities. It's just one of those living activities that we activate because of the pleasure that it brings us. But this word is never used outside of the ethics, at least as far as I've been able to tell. It's not. There's appears apparently a couple of times in fragments of the Protrepticus, but nowhere else. But that's just a word. And the real question is, does Aristotle actually have interesting things to say about curiosity? And that, of course, you can only answer if you've got a view about what curiosity actually is. So, anybody here tell me what the first sentence of Aristotle's Metaphysics is?
Yeah.
Somebody here can.
All men by nature desire to know.
All men by nature desire to know. Fred gets it right. That's right. All human beings by nature desire knowledge or desire to know. Now, the word for desire there, oregomai, has its root meaning as to reach for or stretch out for. But what I'm really interested in that opening sentence of Aristotle's Metaphysics is that by nature. Because in Aristotle, that's probably in contrast to something that you learn or something that you develop a habit for. It's something that's there intrinsically. It's not something that human beings have to learn. In fact, it's something that's built into human nature, if you like. That's the way I take the by nature in this. And that is quite interesting when you look at contemporary views about curiosity. In a recent review article in Neuron, Psychology and Neuroscience of Curiosity, they close with a number of questions. One of those questions is, in what way does curiosity resemble other basic drive states? To what extent is curiosity fundamentally different from drives like hunger and thirst? Now, the background to this paper is that it assumes an intrinsic drive view of curiosity, which was, as far as I can tell, first pushed by Lowenstein in 1994. His idea was that curiosity is driven by what he called an epistemic gap. Just as there's a drive for food that's driven by hunger, by a lack of food, or a drive for thirst because you lack the water that you need. So there's an epistemic gap, a need for knowledge that we have to fulfill. That's not a view that I actually would endorse, but it was the view that led them to think of curiosity as a kind of basic state that is a basic drive in human nature. A recent sort of survey of the literature on the psychological literature on curiosity, you'll notice is subtitled "The Desire to Know and Why Your Future Depends on It." So at least one way that contemporary psychologists think about curiosity is that it is this basic intrinsic desire to acquire knowledge. And so if that's what curiosity fundamentally means, then when Aristotle says all human beings by nature desire to know, he certainly does have a concept of curiosity as we understand that idea. All right, so the general territory of this talk is the centrality of questions and answers to Aristotle's notion of inquiry. The notion of an erotetic logic is the notion of a logic of questions and answers. And when I use the word eroteticism to refer to Aristotle, I'm talking about the centrality of questions and answers in his understanding of the way human inquiry functions. So I'm looking at this talk as a kind of historical, metaphilosophical inquiry rather than a direct study of Aristotle's, the content of Aristotle's thought. What I'm going to be talking about, and this is in fact part of what frames the book that Edouard mentioned in his introduction, is the idea that there are what I call erotetic frameworks at different levels in Aristotle's philosophy. And I'm curious both about the way those frameworks structure his philosophical activity, and I'm also curious about how they're related to one another, how those different layers and levels of framing questions and answers are interact with one another and related to one another. There's a lot of topics in Aristotle that are in the same territory. A key notion in Aristotle's logic is the problema. It's the word that is used as the title for that 38-book long collection called the Aristotelian Problems. Every one of those problems, well, there's one or two exceptions, starts with a question, dia ti, on account of what, or often translated, why? And then usually a series of answers, possible answers, are given after it. And that's just apparently became an absolutely central part of the Aristotelian tradition. But it starts with Aristotle. It starts in his logic, and especially in the prior analytics and the posterior analytics. Likewise, his constant use of aporia, often translated as questions or more often puzzles, to structure his various inquiries. So metaphysics beta, for example, is a long list of puzzles or problems or questions that structure basically the entire argument of the metaphysics, the entire dialectic that takes place. And seeing as I mentioned dialectic, his work on dialectic, the topics, is also very much structured around the idea of a dialogue being a matter of questions and answers, questions and responses. Okay, in the background to this idea of the centrality of questions and answers, curiosity to Aristotle's epistemology, is the idea of an erotetic framework. So I'm going to be arguing that the second book of the Posterior Analytics' primary function is to establish what I call an erotetic framework for any inquiry, so long as the goal of the inquiry is knowledge. So it's non-restrictive, it's domain neutral, as I like to say. Now, I think that framework is shaped by a particular goal that Aristotle has in mind, namely a very specific notion of what scientific knowledge looks like. That's provided in the first book of the Posterior Analytics, so very Aristotelian-like. He first gives you a very clear, well, complicated but clear picture of what the goal of inquiry is, what scientific knowledge should look like, and then in book 2 discusses the kinds of inquiries that hopefully will get you there. But it's very abstract, and it's, as I say, domain neutral. There's a passage in the Eudemian Ethics which I think does a very good job of capturing what I have in mind by domain neutrality. He says, in every field of inquiry, arguments made philosophically differ from those made non-philosophically. One should not then, even when it comes to politics, regard as superfluous the kind of study that makes clear not only the what, but also the on account of what, to dia ti. Again, often you'll get that translated, the why, the what and the why. For this is the philosophical approach in every path of inquiry, and I want to stress that, every path of inquiry. The reason he's saying it here is that if you're in an environment like we're currently in, with a lot of sophists running around doing politics, you might be inclined to say, well, that's just a domain that's off limits when it comes to knowledge. So I think what Aristotle is saying here, no, even politics, folks, you can approach it either philosophically or non-philosophically, and there is a philosophical way to do it, and that is to search out the what and the why of things. Okay, now I, in my title, said that I want to see in Aristotle curiosity as epistemically central, and I want to say a little bit about what I mean by epistemic here. Partly, that's just buying into distinctions that were made in a really seminal article back in 1954 by my compatriot from Canada, D.E. Berlin, A Theory of Human Curiosity, where he distinguishes perceptual and epistemic curiosity along one dimension and specific versus diversive curiosity along the other. And what he had in mind by that first distinction is a distinction between the kind of curiosity where something is ambiguous or puzzling and it grabs your attention and you sort of look at it more carefully to figure out what it actually is, versus a kind of just general drive to know about something where the primary goal is to learn more and more and more about a topic. And the specific versus diversive, you could be epistemically curious about something quite specific, some particular area of knowledge, or you could be epistemically curious in a kind of omnivorous way, just sort of constantly wanting to learn more and more and more about all kinds of different things. But that's not what I really have in mind by epistemic. What I have in mind by epistemic is that Aristotle is not only saying the not so interesting claim that when we're pursuing knowledge, we're trying to seek answers to questions. He's making the more, I think, interesting claim that a successful pursuit of knowledge is really dependent on asking the right kinds of questions and also asking questions in the correct order, and moreover, in specific domains of inquiry, which kinds of questions you ask and the order you ask them becomes very, very important. So there are very rich set of norms having to do with the kinds of questions you ask, the order you ask them in, and which questions you ask depending on what domain of knowledge you're pursuing. In that sense, it's epistemic. It's really about norms governing the process of acquiring knowledge. All right, so let's take a look at the very beginning of Posterior Analytics, Book 2. I think of the two books of the Analytics as On Scientific Knowledge, Book 1, or Demonstration, and On Inquiry, Book 2. And that's because I think this very first sentence that you get in the Posterior Analytics, Book 2, really governs the entire discussion in a way. So what is it? The things into which we inquire are equal in number to those we know scientifically, which immediately raises the question, all right, what are those things and how many are there, seeing as those are the two questions. Now, I want to distinguish the way Aristotle answers that question from another possible way of answering it. You could answer that question in what I call a content way. Well, how many things do we know scientifically? Well, we know about the heavens, we know about animals, we know about plants, we know about plane figures, we know about numbers. So as many things like that as we know about, we also inquire about them. But of course, that's not the way Aristotle answers this question. He's interested in the modes of inquiry. So his answer is what I call the framework answer. We inquire into the fact, the reason why, whether something is and what it is. So he's really interested in 4 distinct modes of inquiry, and he's pretty committed, I think, to saying that's it. When you're in pursuit of knowledge, those are the 4 basic questions that you need to get answers to. The 4 modes of questions you need to get answered to. Okay, so 4 modes of inquiry characterized, as it turns out, as we'll see, in terms of 4 questions. And the interesting thing is those questions are initially characterized in the first chapter of this book of Aristotle's as 2 ordered pairs of questions. So the first ordered pair is it the case that P? That's the getting the answer to the fact question. And why is it the case that P? The second ordered pair is, are there S's or P's? Are there subjects? I mean, S or P there as subject or predicate, subject or attribute. And what are those subjects or attributes? And I see that question as being, in Aristotle, I think purposefully and intentionally ambiguous between a very theory unloaded way of answering that question, moving, he hopes, towards a much more theory-involved answer to that question, a move from just what is something to what is it to be that thing, a move from a early descriptive characterization of the subject through to actually getting at the underlying essence of that subject. So notice that you could just make that as a descriptive claim, but I think Aristotle's view, and I think we'll see this in a second, is that you have to get a positive answer to the first question as a presupposition for going on to ask the second question. So here's what he says about the first pair, and he gives us an example. So we seek whether this or that is the case, for example, whether the sun is in eclipse or not, and we inquire into the fact. So that's the first inquiry. An indication of this is that having discovered that it's in eclipse, we have finished our whether it is inquiry. That inquiry is done if we already know that. And if we know from the start that it's in eclipse, we don't inquire whether it is. And when we know the fact, we seek the reason why. For example, knowing that it is in eclipse or that the Earth moved. Never been quite sure why he introduces that second example there. There are people who have speculated about it. We seek the reason why it is in eclipse or moved. So there needs to be an affirmative answer to that first stage question before you go on to the second stage and ask the next question, in this case, as it will turn out, the causal question. Okay, what about the second pair? Here's what he says about it. We inquire into something in another way, whether there is or is not a centaur or a god, and by whether it is or is not, I mean in an unqualified way. So what he has in mind is I'm not talking about whether centaurs have a particular attribute. I'm asking a question about whether there are centaurs. And knowing that it is, we inquire what it is. For example, what is God or what is man? Now, I do know why he changed the example in this case, because, of course, if you pursue your whether it is inquiry into centaurs, you're going to find out there aren't any. And so that will mean that you can then forget about that, but maybe move on to the question, well, what is man? Okay, so this is moving inquiry, if you like, from establishing the existence of something to establishing its essence, getting an answer to, pursuing an answer to the question, what is it? In some kind of deep sense. Now, there is a puzzle about the examples in this particular case. You'll notice that when he first introduces this distinction between if or whether it is questions of this unqualified kind and what it is questions, he's using examples that are basically substances or entities. The strange thing is that Book 2 of the Posterior Analytics has relatively little to tell us about how you pursue inquiries into those kinds of things. The standard examples are things like eclipses and thunder and leaf shedding and the Nile's flooding and so on and so forth. Very few actual examples of this sort of thing, and it's a bit of a puzzle that he introduces this distinction this way and then tends to talk about it as if we're pursuing questions about what is eclipse or what is thunder, and then always switching those to saying, well, by what is eclipse, I mean, why is the moon suffering eclipse? And when I say what is thunder, I mean, why is there a particular noise in the clouds right now? So he's making it quite clear that he's talking about attributes that belong to some underlying subject rather than talking about the subject itself. I'm not going to pursue that, but it's an interesting issue that you have to think about. Now, that all sounds very, very simple. And Aristotle realizes it not only sounds very, very simple, it sounds way too simple. The second chapter of this very same book begins to make the issue of how these four inquiries are related to one another much more complicated. So he actually ends up saying that there's a way in which all four of the inquiries he mentions in the first chapter are actually causal inquiries. So here's what he says. But we are inquiring, when we inquire about the fact, or the unqualified, whether it is, whether there is a middle for it or not. While, when having come to know either the fact or whether it is, either partially or without qualification, we inquire into the reason why, or the what it is, we are then inquiring what the middle is. Now notice in that last bit, he's saying that even if you're inquiring into either the reason why or the what it is, either one of those questions, you're really inquiring what the middle is. Well, what does he mean by middle? Well, what he's doing here is, of course, bringing in the machinery of the prior analytics, the machinery of syllogistic. And he's saying that what you're really after is either two questions: whether there is a middle for a scientific demonstration, a middle term for a scientific demonstration. And if you've settled that there is, then your next question is what it is. And then he goes on and says, for the middle is the cause. And in all cases, this is the object of inquiry. And I take it what he's saying there is that the object of inquiry, even when you're at the early stages of inquiry, is all those inquiries are causal. Even the preliminary stages of inquiry where you're trying to answer the question, is it the case that something? So there's in this passage, three critical complications compared to what you see in the first chapter. The distinction between obviously pre-causal inquiries and causal inquiries is being minimized. Both of those early stage inquiries are now said to be inquiries about whether there is a cause. Second complication, the distinction between inquiries into cause and essence is also being minimized. So he's saying in either case, you're searching for the cause. You're searching for what the middle is. And the two stages are now treated as both causal inquiries, right? The first step is whether there is a cause. The second step is what is the cause. Now, there's lots of qualifications here. This is only going to work for a certain subset of demonstrative explanations in Aristotle, but it's a fairly large subset. I think the only cases where this actually isn't Aristotle's final view is if what you're going after is the fundamental essence of something, what he calls an unmiddled thing, an immediate thing, where you don't actually have any demonstrative knowledge of it. You just have a cognitive grasp of that thing. Any time where your knowledge depends on having a demonstration, I think this is the view that he's going to defend. Okay, so let me talk about what I think is sort of going on here. I think what Aristotle is giving us is what I refer to as framework norms here. It's his view that if you are pursuing a question, a causal question, a why question, or a what question, if you like, you're assuming when you're pursuing that why question that you've already established the fact that you're asking why about. But Aristotle doesn't stop there, as a lot of contemporary literature does. His view is that the assumption, that P that you're making when you ask those why questions, is justified if it's the result of asking a prior question and getting an affirmative answer to that prior question. Namely, is it the case that P? And similarly with the question of what something is. There's a prior question that has to be established, and you're only justified in going on to ask that what it is question if you've already established that there is the thing that you're going on to pursue that what it is question about. Now, Aristotle is very, very self-conscious about Plato's Meno. Right in the very first chapter of Book 1 of the Posterior Analytics, he mentions it as a concern. And I think all of Book 2, I think it's a cloud hovering over all of Book 2 of the Posterior Analytics too. You can see it here in just thinking about how do we affirmatively answer that whether the subject or the predicate exists question if we don't know anything about what the subject or the predicate is. Aristotle, of course, has an answer to that. It has to do, I think, in part with his view about degrees of knowing something. You can know something at a fairly superficial level without knowing what it is. And I think he's perfectly happy with the idea that it might happen that it turns out when you really do start investigating the subject more deeply, you'll either have to subdivide it into different kinds of things, or maybe you'll have to decide, I was wrong. That's just an accidental connection there. There really isn't anything to be pursued. But at any rate, he knows there's a problem here, and he's worried about it all the way through the analytics. And I think I don't have time to talk about those issues here, but if any of you are interested, there's a really nice discussion of these issues around the Meno paradox in Book 2 of the Analytics in David Bronstein's recent book on Aristotle on knowledge and learning. Okay, so that's what I call framework norms. I think they play a very big role in Aristotle's inquiries. But I also want to argue that they don't get you all the way there. You need what I've been referring to as domain-specific norms, and I think those are generated by asking domain-specific questions. Why do I think the erotetic framework from the Analytics isn't sufficient? Well, I think there are at least three reasons. There may be more. These are the three that I've been focused on. First of all, Aristotle is very cognizant of the way in which the subject matters in different domains of inquiry are irreducibly different. He rejects Pythagorean attempts to reduce everything to a mathematical inquiry. He rejects a Platonic view that everything is in fact going to be an inquiry into the world of forms. He rejects the materialistic approach of somebody like Democritus. he sees each domain as having very distinct objects of inquiry and requiring very different methods. He also is hyper-aware of the differences in epistemic access that we have to the different subjects. There's a really nice passage at the beginning of chapter 5 of book 1 of the Parts of Animals, where he contrasts our epistemic status with respect to the animals and plants around us and our epistemic status with respect to the heavenly bodies that we have very little perceptual information about. And finally, he of course famously likes to argue that you can approach exactly the same object from a number of different perspectives. He likes to use that word qua a lot. And a good example here is his study of the rainbow in Meteorology Book 3. In Meteorology Book 3, he uses mathematical optics to explain certain attributes. So he looks at rainbows, for example, as a particular embodiment of a particular kind of geometric configuration. And you can use a certain subdomain of geometry in order to help you understand those attributes of rainbows. But rainbows also have multiple colors. They're caused by a particular kind of physical interaction that takes place in the world. And for that, you need to take the approach not of a mathematician, but as a natural philosopher in understanding those aspects of the rainbow. Okay, so what that means is these specific inquiries that Aristotle is involved in will require not just those abstract norms that you get from the analytics, but domain-specific norms as well. And the interesting thing is, when you look at where those come from, what you find is that Aristotle is at the beginning of virtually every treatise he writes on a specific subject that he's inquiring into. He'll start with a set of questions that are raised by that particular subject of inquiry, and then start working at answering those questions. And the questions are always domain specific. I can't go into specific details here, but if you pick up, for example, Parts of Animals, Book 1, it's really the philosophical introduction to Aristotle's whole biological enterprise, and it's all structured around a whole bunch of questions that need to be answered about how to go about the enterprise. For example, should we study the final cause first prior to the efficient cause, or should we study the efficient cause first prior to the final cause? That's not a question that you would ask in mathematics, but it's a question that you pretty much have to ask in biology as far as Aristotle's concerned. All right. So that's at a very low level of domain specificity, but Aristotle's biology and his meteorology and his cosmology are all parts of natural science. So what I want to talk a little bit about now is the way in which there's a kind of nested hierarchy of these framework norms and how those are related to one another. So famously, in the second chapter of the Posterior Analytics, Aristotle gives you a statement about what it means to have unqualified scientific knowledge of something, right? And he says that unqualified scientific knowledge of something is when you know the cause on account of which that thing is as it is, and know that it must be that way. Now, that, however, hides a basic problem for Aristotle. In Book 2, Chapter 11, he starts out by reminding you of what he said in Chapter 2 of Book 1. We think we have scientific knowledge when we know the cause. But there's a problem. There are 4 causes. And then he also reminds you of something you learned in Book 1, that all proof comes to be through a middle term. Well, but now there's going to be a big problem if you need to have 4 different terms in that middle term position. How exactly does it work? Do we have 4 different demonstrations of each thing? Is there some way in which we can get all of the four causes packed into one middle term? What's going on? How do these two things work out together? And Aristotle really doesn't say very much about that in the Posterior Analytics. But it is something he worries about a lot when he gets to physics, as a matter of fact. So right at the beginning of the physics, very first paragraph, book 1, chapter 1, he again reminds us of what he said in the Posterior Analytics concerning every inquiry to know, that is to know scientifically, those things about which there are principles, causes, and elements. Knowledge comes from knowing those things, that is, knowing the principles, causes, and elements. For we think ourselves to know each thing when we know the primary causes and primary principles. And that's true even in the case of the scientific knowledge of nature. So, analytics framework in place, but now he says that the inquiry isn't just aimed at causes, but at principles and elements. Now, there are uses of these terms, idea, archai, stoicheia, where they overlap to an extent, and they can all mean the same thing, but I don't think that's what's going on here, because as it turns out, he's giving you the setup for the first two books of the physics. Book 1 is focused almost entirely on the principles of natural change, the archai of natural change, and says almost nothing about causality. He talks about change being in an underlying subject and going from one contrary to another, but says almost nothing about what causes those changes to take place. Whereas Book 2 is focused almost entirely on causation and doesn't say very much at all about those principles that he introduced in Book 1. We really are being told something about a particular inquiry, namely the inquiry we were going to be engaged in natural science. And then there's that four-causal issue that I mentioned, that gets mentioned in the Posterior Analytics, but we're not told very much about how to deal with the issue. Now, interestingly, in Book 2, Chapter 3, it's famously where the four causes are introduced. Here it is, but notice how the analytics framework is right there in the background. For since our inquiry is for the sake of knowing, and we don't think we know each thing until we grasp on account of what about it, and this is to grasp the primary cause, and so on and so forth. So there it is. To know something without qualification, to know it scientifically, is to know its causes, especially its primary cause. But he's already said we're investigating with causes both what they are and how many they are. And he immediately introduces the four causes. But what's really interesting is nature is hardly discussed at all in this chapter. And in fact, this chapter happens to be almost a doublet, except for that introductory paragraph that I have there, of the discussion of causality in Book Delta of the Metaphysics, his so-called philosophical lexicon. So that chapter's discussion of causation doesn't actually seem to be very much about causation in nature. However, notice how he introduces the final cause. He clearly thinks this is the one that he needs to say something special about, because he introduces it with an erotetic defense. Again, cause is spoken of as end, as telos. And this is that for the sake of which usually gets translated final cause. The end of walking, for example, is health. Why is he walking? We reply, in order to be healthy. And saying this, we think we have given the cause. So basically, he's saying if we've got an irreducibly distinct answer to the question, on account of what, where it's the telos, or that for the sake of which, that we specify, that's sufficient to say we have a distinctive kind of cause in place. All right, so all of the examples in that chapter are non-natural with one or two questionable exceptions. Statues, goblets, musical intervals, deliberative actions, medical advice, piloting boats, all kinds of stuff, but nothing natural. And Book 2, Chapter 7 starts the same way, but then says, so this is how many the causes are. Since there are 4, it's for the natural scientist to know all of them, and he'll answer the question on account of what? There's that dia T again. In a way appropriate to natural science, by getting back to all of them. And then he gives them in the canonical way that you're all used to, right? This is almost the only place where he actually names the 4 causes this way: matter, form, moving cause, and that for the sake of which. So what he's saying is we have to get answers to this question, why or on account of what, and the answer must be given in a physikos way, in a way appropriate for natural science. So what does he mean by that? Well, he's giving you all of these ways of answering questions about natural objects. What's it constituted of? What is it to be that thing? What are the source of its changes? What are the goals and functions that it's either designed for or seeks? Now, all of these are interesting ways of identifying the nature of a thing, as it turns out. They're all related to Aristotelian natures in fascinating ways. In Chapter 2, Aristotle argues that natural things have 2 natures. Their matter and their form. So 2 of the 4 causes are in fact directly the natures of the things. But then in this chapter, Chapter 7, he says that 3 of the 4 causes come to 1. What does he mean by that? He gives us this gnomic saying that he repeats over and over and over again: for a human being generates a human being. What he has in mind, and he spells it out a little bit here, is that the goal of generation is the same in form, or identical in form, to that which is the motive cause of that process of generation. So the motive cause, the goal, and the form are all one and the same thing, in a way. All right, so what I want to do now in the last few minutes I have available to me is just to zero in a little bit on the biological case. The analytics provides the framework. It's still in place. So you can see it here in the conclusion to the methodological introduction to the history of animals. We need to grasp the facts first, and then we may attempt to discover the causes. The goal, again, is demonstration, as you see. Similarly, as he begins his discussion of the parts of animals in Book 2 of the Parts of Animals, he says we've established the facts in our history about the animals. It's the causes owing to which each animal has this character that must now be examined. And when he's doing animal locomotion, he says, okay, we've established in the history of nature that these things are the case. Now it's the reason why we must go on to. And it's all using exactly the same language that you find in the analytics framework. However, here's a passage in the prior analytics where he basically says the analytics framework isn't going to be sufficient. The majority of principles for each science are distinctive to it. Consequently, it's for experience to provide the principles concerning each subject. For instance, astronomical experience for the science of astronomy. Now that's really interesting because it's talking about experience in a domain-specific way. You need astronomical experience for astronomy, and presumably you need biological experience for biology. Okay, so this passage raises all kinds of questions. How does experience do this providing? What's the nature of this discovery process that he's assuming is going on in this passage? Well, he's not going to tell you anything about that in the analytics. And I'm conscious of the time here, and I want to give you an example. So I'm going to rip through some of the stuff that's pretty much already been said. And take a look at an example of Aristotle exploring respiration, which is part of a treatise in his Parva Naturalia. What I want you to consider is that knowledge that's gained by dissection in this case is a crucial fact-gathering aspect of the domain, but what Aristotle is going to be saying in the passages I'm about to show you is that unless that fact-gathering is already viewed as a causal inquiry, specifically a teleological causal inquiry, you're not going to be gathering the data properly. You're not going to be gathering. So you have to have that question in mind right from the start. And that's the point, I take it, of Posterior Analytics 2.2. So this is the way he starts that discussion. A few of natural philosophers have spoken about respiration, yet for what purpose it belongs to animals, they've either said nothing or they've spoken poorly because of lack of experience. So we need both appropriate experience in order to get good answers to this question, and we need to be considering the question, what is breathing for? What is respiration for? Now, in chapter 3, after having given a fair amount of criticism of his predecessors on this topic, he then says, the most significant reason my predecessors have failed here is that they're inexperienced with the internal parts, and they've not grasped that nature makes them all for the sake of something. And then he says, for inquiring for the sake of what respiration belongs to animals, and examining this question in the presence of parts, in the presence of gills and lungs, they would have discovered the cause quickly. So this is a kind of defense of what I call teleological dissection or teleological anatomy. The question for what end does respiration belong to animals is the question, but notice he's asking that question about parts. What are the parts for? And he says lungs and gills. That's also curious because Aristotle doesn't think gills are for respiration. He thinks respiration is air breathing. So why does he even mention gills? Okay, well, I'll tell you. You'd have to read all the way to chapter 18 before you'd know the answer. So spoiler alert, if you plan on doing that, anatomical experience suggests that gills serve the same function as lungs. The what are they for question gets the same answer in both cases. And he figures that out by doing dissection and noticing that the connections between the gills and the heart are very similar to the connections between the heart and the lungs in animals that have lungs. And he notices that the movement of the gills is very similar to the movement of the lungs that human beings and other animals use when they're breathing in and out. And he thinks, okay, they're cooling themselves with water, not with air, but they're still cooling themselves, which is what he thinks lungs are for. And all the way through the first 7 chapters where he's reviewing previous thinkers on respiration, he's criticizing them for not asking the teleological question in their inquiries. And if they don't do that, they might not even bother to do dissection because they might not even have the right question in mind. And it's a very common problem that Aristotle has with his predecessors. Here's another passage in Generation of Animals criticizing Democritus for exactly the same thing, for not asking the teleological question when he's doing his inquiries. Okay, so I said I would come back to the Posterior Analytics, Book 2, Chapter 2, and offer a Aristotelian speculation about what the connection is between being able, having the ability to form concepts and link those concepts in propositions, and asking why questions. Remember in Book 2, Chapter 2, he says that we're always searching for either if there is a middle or what the middle is, and that means we're searching for whether there is a cause and what the cause is. So how do we get to that stage? I think for Aristotle, we get to that stage by searching for commensurate universal relationships. That's the subject matter of Book 2, Posterior Analytics, Book 2, chapters 14 through 18, is how we start with sort of low-level common sense experience and get to the point where we've actually nailed down commensurately universal relationships at the right level of universality. That's the last step before we start searching for the cause, he thinks. And even when that search breaks down, as it does in the case of lungs, heart, and gills, see, the problem he has with respiration is it's for cooling the heart. And 3 out of his 4 blooded kinds, the kinds with hearts, have lungs to perform that function. But there's a 4th kind, fish. They don't. So how do they perform this function? Do they perform this function? And if so, how do they do it? That's the question that motivates him to start thinking about, well, are gills doing the same thing that lungs are doing? And that's what drives the question. So Aristotle actually, at the end of On Respiration, moves away from the subject of respiration. And he focuses at one level higher up, cooling, where all across the blooded animals, there's at least an analog relationship between gills and lungs. They're all performing the same function. Okay, so in that case, I think the kind of dissection, fact-gathering process that gets you to that level has to be guided, in Aristotle's view, by this teleological why question all the way along. Okay, so supposing Rory, my grandson, asks me, Grandpa, why do peacocks have feathers? And I offer him the facile, useless response, because they're birds, Rory, and all birds have feathers. They're covered with feathers. Well, Rory is smart, so he would check that, first of all. Do all birds have feathers? And I would, of course, say, well, yes, Rory, they do. But Rory is smart. So he will then say, but Grandpa, why do birds all have feathers? And, of course, I would say something like, yeah, we do. Actually, I was thinking maybe what I would say is, let me tell you about Evo Devo, but I'm probably not quite ready for that yet. Anyway, there he is, considering the peacock. Thanks very much.